Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. Our final session in our Memory Wars Conference, Day of Infamy, Public Memory of World War II in Japan and the United States. To chair this session, we've called on one of our amazing friends and one of the leading figures in the field of history, Dr. Jim Grossman, to chair. Dr. Grossman is Executive Director of the American Historical Association. He was previously Vice President for Research and Education at the Newberry Library and has taught at the University of Chicago, the University of California, San Diego. He's the author of The Land of Hope, Chicago, Black Southerners, and the Great Migration, and A Chance to Make Good, African Americans 1900-1929, which received awards from the Gustavus Myers Center for Human Rights and the Illinois State Historical Society. Dr. Grossman was project director and co-editor of the Print and Digital Encyclopedia of Chicago, and is editor emeritus of the series Historical Studies of Urban America. Dr. Grossman's consulting experience includes history-related projects generated by the BBC, Smithsonian and various theater companies, filmmakers, museums, libraries, and foundations. He's currently president of the National Humanities Alliance, and he's served on the governing boards of the American Council of Learned Societies, Association of American Colleges and Universities, and the Center for Research Libraries. So with that impressive resume, Dr. Jim Grossman, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, and I want to thank everybody from the staff of the museum for all the work that you've done on this conference. I have been listening all day. The discussions are absolutely fascinating. And I have already been recommending to people that they tune in once everything is available on the internet. And thank you for that very generous introduction. We're going to be a little less formal for this session, so I'm almost embarrassed about that introduction. Our final session features two distinguished scholars who have already played prominent roles in this conference. Carol Gluck and Rob Citino will take as their starting point memories of December 7th in U.S. history and memory, and move towards some comparison with how we remember and think historically about 9/11. That said, as historians, we know that how we think about the past is always conceptualized in the world, conceptualized and contextualized in the world in which we live. This conference was organized and contextualized and conceptualized before two other dates imprinted themselves as new emblems of threats to democracy. January 6th, 2021, 8 blocks from where I sit right now, east of the United States Capitol, and February 24th in Ukraine. I'm going to leave it to Carol and Rob as to how they want to approach the considerable challenge of at once bringing together the conversations over the past 2 days, a comparison between two signal events of the American past, with one of them seen from two different national perspectives, the United States and Japan, and the context of a national and international present. What I would venture to highlight is the importance of questioning the very notion of collective or national memory, which I realize is perhaps a bit sacrilegious in this context. Is there a Japanese memory of December 7th, 1941? Versus an American memory? I'm not so sure. Consider as an example an event I know more about, another military event identified by time and place, the attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, by Americans prepared to mount a rebellion in defense of the supposed right of some Americans to own, buy, and sell other Americans. That is not how the history of that day was passed on to the American people for nearly a century, or actually probably more than a century. Given the controversies over the past decade over Confederate monuments and other iconography, I don't think I need to document the existence and significance of different memories and different histories, and the importance of the persistence of those different memories and different histories. Earlier this afternoon, Mark Pachter referred to the different ways in which Native Americans, another example, remember various military events quite differently from what one might refer to as a national memory imprinted in popular culture. There are other controversies in the world in which we live as historians, swirling around regarding the use of specific dates as emblems of national development, but I don't think I'm going to open that can of worms, which relates to the dates 1619 and 1776. We have enough on our plates as it is. For example, today, there has been, yesterday, there has been much talk about victims, perpetrators, heroes. How do we memorialize victims without making them into heroes? How do we memorialize the roles of perpetrators? We can't pretend that innocent victims performed heroic acts. We can't pretend that perpetrators were not part of the history, that a commemorative event or site exists to educate future generations regarding our history. How do we honor heroes and mourn victims without creating memorials and commemorations that instantiate nationalist myths, perhaps in the name of heritage, rather than the kinds of histories from which we can learn? This has all been part of the fascinating conversations I've been listening to today. This merely introduces a conversation between two people who know a lot more than I do. Carol Gluck is the George Sansom Professor of History in the Department of History and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. She specializes in the history of modern Japan from the mid-19th century to the present, with writings in modern social and cultural history, international relations, World War II, and history writing and public memory in Japan and the West. Rob Citino joined the National World War II Museum in 2016 as the Samuel Zemurray, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Stone Senior Historian. He's an award-winning military historian and a scholar who has published 10 books. He enjoys close ties with the U.S. military establishment and has taught 1 year at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and 2 years at the U.S. Army War College. Carol, Rob, it's all yours.
Carol, it is so wonderful to have you here today, even if only on our airwaves rather than in person. You were here, I think, when we first conceived this memory conference. You've been in some of the earliest conversations. We've had floods and plagues and every manner of problem getting this thing going, and I'm just really delighted to be at least face-to-face with you on the screen today.
Yes, thank you. I'm delighted to be here too, and my tribute to all of you who've managed to persevere and make this conference happen after so many setbacks. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. I have to say I'm having a little computer problem right now, which is unfortunate, but I hope that I don't disappear on you.
You look and sound strong from my perspective right now. So we'll pray to the computer gods and hope that continues.
Okay, good.
So we have a fascinating and challenging topic today, I would say. How today's Japan looks back at World War II in general. How, perhaps more specifically, it looks at this Pearl Harbor event, which is so seminal to U.S. history in the period, but also how those memories may be changing, because I think that's one of the things we all agree on as historians of memory, is that it's almost never a static concept. So, Carol, if I may, let's start with the basic question. how do Japanese and American memories of World War II differ? I know as an American born in 1958, father fought in the Pacific, in fact, on Guadalcanal. I certainly was raised with certain memories of World War II, and I wonder how those memories might differ from the way the Japanese look back at the wartime era.
Oh, well, Jim just said he wondered whether there was a Japanese memory and a American memory of Pearl Harbor, and the answer is yes, not just one memory, and I think that's what he's pointing to. But they do differ. I mean, every war story of the Second World War around the world is national. To the degree that I work very hard to do what I call keep the world in World War II, which has become my mantra, we are dealing with different national, often nationalistic stories. And every nation chooses its own iconic events for its story. So maybe the United States chooses Pearl Harbor and D-Day often in depictions, or Great Britain chooses the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, or France, the Resistance and Liberation. But they are different. And each one of these national stories embeds these iconic events in a narrative. And that narrative is generally very, very simple. It's usually created originally during the war or right after the war. And they are stories that are designed or intended, I suppose, to articulate the unity of the people, sometimes quite frequently called a people's war. And whether as victors or victims, these are kind of total stories for total wars. It's what I think of as heroic narratives. And they're heroic not because they're filled with heroes by any means, but because they're so simple and so black and white. They're like historical one-liners, like Gunther Bischoff talked about Austria, the first victim of Nazism. That's one of these stories. Or what Elizabeth Samet told us about when she sees the story of the good war, the myth having evolved. So the U.S. story begins with Pearl Harbor, and in terms present already in FDR's Day of Infamy speech in 1941. And it continues to victory, first in Europe and then in the Pacific. Well, the Japanese story also begins with Pearl Harbor, but it's a negative event that initiates what was called immediately a reckless war that culminated in the atomic bombings, which gave post-war Japan its mission for peace. That's the historical one-liner. It's as if the Pearl Harbor attack were coupled with the atomic bombings in a kind of balanced moral equation with a positive post-war outcome. Now, this story has a context, because every one of these heroic narratives that I've studied around the world was very much determined by the context in which it was formed, whether it was defeat, as in Japan, civil war, as in China, as you heard from Rana Mitter, national colonial liberation, as in Indonesia, and occupation, foreign occupation, as in Austria, Germany, Korea, and Japan. So Japan's context for this story that I've just told you about, this Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima story, the context was the American occupation. And already in the fall of 1945, the occupation authorities directed a major Japanese newspaper to publish a true history of the war. And they oversaw a change in the name of the war from the Greater East Asia War, which was what the war that the Japanese fought in their aggressive war in Asia, to the Pacific War, 1941 to 1945, Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, which was, of course, the war between America and Japan. But in fact, Japan had been engaged in an aggressive and total war against China since July of 1937. Began at Marco Polo Bridge, as Rana mentioned, where that museum is in Beijing. And the China War, which had become a quagmire, Japan wasn't winning, was the reason for the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor attack was to prevent the United States from interfering with Japan's ability to fight its war and keep its empire in Asia. So leaving the China War out of Japan's war story, reducing it to 1941 to 45, was an omission of enormous consequence. And that omission came back with a vengeance to confront Japanese war memory in the 1990s. So that story is a reduced, not only oversimple, but it leaves out the main experience of Japan in World War II, which is the war in the Asian mainland.
Carol, I'm just sitting here, and I must confess, I was wishing I'd once had an opportunity to take a class from you. That was a masterful summary of some very complex material. Well, let's talk, if you don't mind, to broaden the story then a little bit. You've mentioned that for the Japanese, Pearl Harbor somewhere in the middle of the story. Japan had already been engaged in war for some time. So how did the other Asian nations then view the war? You're a historian of Japan predominantly, but you are also an expert on Asian memory. How does the war appear to the Chinese? You mentioned the Indonesians. I might think of the Vietnamese as well. Jim asked us this challenging question, but there's really numerous World War IIs, aren't there? Depending on who you are and where you happen to be at the time.
Yes, there are numerous World War IIs. They don't all begin on the same date, and they do not all end on the same date. There's no question of that. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll tell you, rather than go into detail, let me just give you the sort of simple stories that these nations tell themselves, the heroic narrative stories. Rana Mitter has explained how China's story was a unified battle against, in what they call the war against Japanese aggression, and the presentation was the communists won the war against Japan. That's the original story. It's changed, all right, but that's the original story, and that's because in the middle of civil war and communists fighting the nationalists, that was this necessary story for them to tell. When it's in a place like Indonesia, which declared independence immediately after the surrender in August of 1945, the war was told as the beginning of an independent Indonesia. Now, was it really the beginning? No, because the Dutch came back and there was fought a war to maintain the Dutch East Indies as a colony for another 4 years. But the story of the Second World War in Indonesia is not about the wartime occupation, which you think it might be, since it was a very long occupation, 3 years and 8 months, something like that. It was about the beginning of independent Indonesia. Indochina is a different story again, because Indochina ends the war, moves from a Vichy regime under a Japanese collaboration to all-out war against France, and first against France until 1954, and then against America to 1975. So every war was different. I don't want to say that these memories are not tied to the situation. Malaya, I mean, I could go on. Malaya was in a civil war, again, with the communist insurrection and with the British trying to come back. So these countries, I'll give you one more example because it's very important for East Asia now, and that from memory of war, and that's Korea. So Korea had been a Japanese empire, a Japanese colony since 1910, and it was a fairly brutal colonial rule, certainly as the Koreans understood it. The Koreans had fought for the Japanese in the Imperial Army. They had been taken POWs. They had been, so they had been taken as forced laborers. In any case, 1945. August 15th, August 14th, was considered to be the day of liberation from Japanese colonial rule. But it was actually liberation into a direct military occupation by the United States. followed a few years later by the division of the country, of the peninsula, into two, North Korea and South Korea, followed by the Korean War. So these countries all had different experiences, although they were all in some way occupied by Japan, invaded by Japan, colonized by Japan. But their memories are situated differently within the national frames.
This is just reminding me how truly complex this story is, and the development of memory in Asia by region, by different country. It truly would require a lifetime of study. I taught American undergraduates for decades, and I know this to be relatively a blank slate for many Americans, even well-educated young people who consider themselves well-read on World War II, who knew something about the Japanese war in China. I think we've underestimated, I would say, as Americans, we've underestimated the complexity of all this, haven't we?
Well, I would echo Alex, Ritchie, and a few others, Omer Bartov too, who tell you that we've underestimated the war in the East. We've underestimated the war in East and Central Europe. What Omer called the unforgettable war if you're in those parts of the world, but the forgotten war if you're in the West. And part of that is because of the Cold War. So we don't know enough about this is a global war. We don't know enough about the geometry of global war. They were all connected. These were separate theaters in one sense, but the diplomacy and the supply and the politics were all globally and geometrically connected. So I would say that it's not just Asia. And let me just point the finger at everybody else too. Most of the countries don't know very much about anything else but themselves and their proximate enemies. So this is the problem with national memory and why I'm trying to keep the world in World War II. So I wouldn't be so. I would say this is a global condition of not knowing about the war in the way it actually happened, which was actually globally. I mean, you can go back and it's very interesting because when you tell the story of Japan and the United States at war, often you just talk about the Americans becoming more harsh with their policies toward Japan from 1939 to 1940, 41, freezing assets, et cetera, and so forth. But it's also clear from some work by American historians that Roosevelt had in mind what was going on in China and was worried. This is part of the story of the quarantine speech too, but was worried about a two-front war that would put the Soviet Union at risk. And he was sort of sending messages to the Japanese through this kind of diplomacy. Those stories are lost, but that was actually part of the global geometry of war. So I would say we all need to keep the world in World War II. It's not just the United States, and it's just the national frames that sort of imprison, if you like, this history and particularly the memory.
Keeping the world in World War II is going to become my new mantra. I think it's wise advice indeed. I'm fascinated with the subject of Hiroshima. To Americans, it's the end of something. I was taught as an American student, as far back as I can remember, the atomic bombs ended World War II in the Pacific and in Asia. You just described very briefly when you mentioned Hiroshima earlier that for the Japanese, it's the beginning of something. It's a period of a new national mission, a new self-image. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I'll also tell you, just to sort of set the scene, that in the book that I've been working on about war memory globally, I have some case studies about how memory actually changed in some cases, and how the heroic narrative gets complicated a little bit in the way that Elizabeth Samet was suggesting. But the one narrative that hasn't changed in any country that I know of is actually the atomic bomb narrative. It seems locked in place. And I find that very interesting. It doesn't mean that there haven't been changes within the countries about different viewpoints and different, but the heroic narratives, they kind of stay. And so what that is for Japan is that, as you just said, the bomb gave Japan a mission for peace. So the bomb doesn't end the war, it begins the post-war, right? In the Americans' view, the bomb is the end of the story. It's the end of the war. It's the phrase is, or the sentence is, the bomb ended the war and saved American lives. They almost put it on a postage stamp in 1995. Bombs hasten war's end was written on the stamp. So the Japanese atomic story doesn't include the war, the aggressive war that preceded Hiroshima, and the American story doesn't do much with the nuclear arms race and other negative things that followed Hiroshima. I mean, and this was what lay at the heart of that controversy over the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian in 1995. The two sides both stories were truncated. One tells the beginning, one tells the end. And that's, I think, that's a very interesting to me. You can understand why that would be true, but it's a blind spot. In a way, it's a blind spot, at least in the heroic narratives on both sides. If you put the stories together, if you started with the war that Japan began, and you got to the bomb that Americans dropped to end the war, and you got to the nuclear arms race and what we know about nuclear warfare now, then you'd have the full story. Or a fuller story, perhaps, not a full story.
Let me, while we're on the subject of Hiroshima, very famous event from the American perspective, President Barack Obama visiting Hiroshima in May of 2016. How important was this event to I was going to say the evolution of Japanese memory on the bomb? You've already said that's not really happening in any direct way. How important was President Obama's visit to Hiroshima? It certainly was. In America, it depended upon your political point of view, where you stood on either side of the aisle as to how you viewed the president going to Hiroshima. I wonder if you could make a few comments about that.
Oh, that's so interesting that you say that, because, you're right. There was a controversy in the United States about it, right? He shouldn't be going to and he should definitely not say I'm sorry. There was a lot of comment like that. But
no bowing. The Japanese, he shouldn't be bowing, right? That was something else we constantly heard.
That's right. That's right. Shouldn't be bowing. Bill Clinton bowed. He shouldn't bow. Right. But on the Japanese side, it was so well received. No apology was given. No apology was expected. He made his speech was about a nuclear-free future. He gave a survivor of the bombings a hug, which went over really well. And the backstory, I think, so the story on the Japanese side is they liked it and they loved him. And, it just tells you how the Japanese view the bomb. It's often said in earlier years that Japanese talked about the atomic bombs as if they fell from the sky, as rather than from B-29s, or rather from airplanes. They had sort of, except for the left and the progressives, which are fierce about atomic bombs, most Japanese didn't hold it against the Americans. And so this is not a new phenomenon that they would have welcomed Obama, but it took 71 years for him to go. And the backstory was leading up to it very carefully. 10 years before that, the ambassador went. It was really kind of orchestrated over the years. And when he went, it was a success with Japan and almost no negative feeling. And then, Prime Minister Abe paid a return visit. You give a return gift. Someone gives you a gift, you give one back. So Prime Minister Abe, who is this conservative nationalist prime minister at the time, and now he's a conservative nationalist ex-prime minister, he paid a return visit by going to Pearl Harbor on the that same year, December of 2016. And it was the first time that the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Japan appeared together at Pearl Harbor. And it was the first time that the Prime Minister of Japan had ever actually stood on the Arizona Memorial. No apologies again, but we must never repeat the horrors of war, etc. So what is all that about? Both of them? Both of them are symbolic politics performing the importance of the Japanese-American alliance for the two nations. And I would add for Obama that his idea of a nuclear-free future was very important for him. That goes back to his 2009 Cairo speech. So that's symbolic politics, symbolic wreath laying, if you like.
I wonder, Carol, if I can ask you one more question about the bomb, not to obsess on it, but we'll move on from the subject in a moment. There were two cities attacked. Hiroshima has become an icon. Americans often go to Hiroshima and come back quite moved. I wonder, how does Japanese memory hold the horrible event at Nagasaki just a few days later in August of 1945? Is Nagasaki forever destined to be in the shadow when something happens second, I suppose?
That's a bad metaphor, in the shadow of the atomic bomb. You didn't mean to say that. It's true that Hiroshima has become the icon. Hiroshima stands for the atomic bombings the way Auschwitz stands for the Holocaust. It's that kind of a word, or Stalingrad or Nanjing, these kinds of words. In Japan as well, Hiroshima receives more attention in public memory. They are both, the anniversaries of the bomb every year, every August, 6th and 9th, are commemorated in both places. Yet Hiroshima does seem to get more attention. I think there are reasons for this. The cities themselves treated their atomic experience differently, their memory. There was a saying in the 1950s that Nagasaki prays, Hiroshima rages. And what that was referring to was that the way that Hiroshima, the city, made peace and anti-nuclear activism its post-war identity, its mission. It is still today. And Nagasaki, which was the home of the largest Catholic cathedral in Japan, destroyed by the atomic bomb, turned its face, if you like, to becoming a city, they said, of culture and trade. And indeed, Nagasaki figures, mayors and things, have criticized Hiroshima for constantly emphasizing the bomb rather than the war that led to the bombing. But in general, I would say most Japanese think of the atomic bombs, both of them together, as a single event and a single lesson as the only country, as they say, to have experienced atomic warfare.
That's a fascinating comparison. Now, in general, I think it's fair to say that Japan is known for not having confronted its wartime past. Nationalist and revisionist positions seem to still often hold sway, denying wartime actions, the Nanjing massacre, the comfort women, other atrocities. Why is that so? Can you tell us something about the chronology of Japanese war memory? I've heard you say in previous talks that the development of Japanese memory is similar to that of Eastern Europe, and I've since the end of the Cold War. I found that fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about Japanese memory of these atrocities, these things that obviously, if you do something horrible, you try to forget them or perhaps cover them up. I just wonder what's going on here.
Okay, that's really a good question, and I thank you for asking it, because it's really important to realize that Japanese didn't cover up or avoid the war. They rehearsed the Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima story endlessly for decades, right? For decades. They had a war story. It just didn't have China in it, right? And it was pitched toward the post-war, toward the future. Let me give you an example. Most countries celebrate the anniversaries of the end of the war. And they say the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. In Japan, that anniversary is always called the 50th anniversary of the post-war, the 75th anniversary of the post-war, to give you an idea of how the end of the war, the post-war, is more important than the war. So they rehearsed that. Then what happened in, well, I should say they rehearsed it, but there were reasons why they rehearsed it. And it was frozen memory because, well, it was congenial, peace and prosperity of post-war Japan, but it was also frozen by the U.S.-Japan Cold War alliance. I mean, we had lost China. We were not interested in Japan's war in Asia. So what happened with the rise of China and the other Asian economies in the 1980s, those nations began to call for Japan to confront its wartime actions and atrocities in Asia. And also, the end of the Cold War meant that the United States was no longer the only country or power that mattered in Japan's foreign policy. Now Asia mattered too, which it hadn't, at least in this narrative. And so the 1990s saw an explosion of war memory, with Japanese called upon to confront everything that they had done, war and empire, actions and atrocities, in Asia. And China and South Korea made Japan's history problem, as they call it, increasingly central in regional geopolitics. So when you talk about what the Japanese were denying or covering up or revising, it's always the China War. So they're confronted in the 1990s with shall I tell you a story on myself? I'll tell you a story on me. In 1991, the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I was pontificating, as you can tell, I do very easily. And I said 50 years is too long. I was talking about Pearl Harbor now. 50 years is too late to confront the problems of the past. And a week later, the first Korean comfort women went on the broadcast their stories of what they had experienced. And after that, after December of 91, I was so wrong, because after that, it was one thing after another. It was the sex slaves of the Imperial Japanese Army, the comfort women. It was the Korean and Taiwanese colonial soldiers of the Japanese Imperial military. It was forced labor. It was the Nanjing massacre. It was biological warfare, chemical warfare, all through the 90s. And as the Japanese memory confronted this, the name of the war actually changed. And in 1995, you began to see the Asia-Pacific War finally returning the name of the war to where it actually took place. And so this was a surge of war memory. It was completely, from the beginning, they had to start afresh. And the conservatives and the right wing, they were the ones who denied the Nanjing massacre, or denied that the sex slaves, that the comfort women were sex slaves of the imperial military. You'll notice that no Japanese right-wing conservative has ever revised Pearl Harbor. They have not revised. They revised the China War because this was an onslaught of memory. And on the other side, for China, South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, these countries were retelling their story in much more nationalistic terms. The 90s is the period of nationalism, which then turns to populism in the following, after the turn of the century, in many places. And so they were telling very nationalistic stories, and the Japanese were telling, those deniers, those revisionists were telling nationalistic stories. In fact, that was the reason for the toxic politics between Japan and Korea, Japan and China, etc. And that's what happened. Alex told you, and you heard about it with Omer. That's what happened in Eastern Europe. You had frozen memory under the Soviet memory regime, where all from the Baltics to the Balkans, they were all supposed to be anti-fascist together. And when they were liberated from that memory regime, they all went and retold their national stories, very often nationalistically, and collapsed the Nazis and the communists to account for double invasion, triple invasion, decades of communist rule. So their frozen memory also unfroze, which is why in the 1990s in Japan, in East Asia and in Eastern Europe, some people say the post-war only began then, because war memory is a huge issue in both regions, and that's where Putin is. It's exactly where he is, but it's not new. And the same is true with East Asia. You could look at Western Europe. Western Europe had already done this memory work. They did it with NATO. They did it with the European Iron and Steel Community. They did it with the European Community. They did it with the EU. France and Germany, which had been at each other's national throats for centuries, were part of Europe together. But they had 40 years, 50 years to do that. By 1995, Western Europe had no problem commemorating the war. But in 1995, it was almost impossible to commemorate the war in Eastern Europe, and they fussed about who's going to go to which country, etc. So this is a chronology of war memory that is determined by the political change within countries and between them. It's domestic politics and geopolitics. It's what I call the chronopolitics of memory. You heard about it all through this conference, about the present changing the past. And what's changing it, one of the main drivers, not the only one, is these political changes. And so the story changes. And that's why I think Eastern Europe and East Asia are so roiled with toxic memory politics today. And that's why if Putin calls for the denazification of Ukraine, which may sound overwrought to us, has real resonance for many Russians, for whom it sometimes feels right now as if the Great Patriotic War just ended last month.
That's a fascinating account and comparison. Let me focus in on just a couple of that was mega. Let's get a little more micro right now and ask two specific questions, if you don't mind. How did the present-day Japanese view the reign of Hirohito, the Showa era? Certainly, again, as an American, he's had multiple overlapping identities. He was the great war criminal who launched World War II. Then he became a harmless butterfly collector and apparently a nice old man. So who is the emperor, or at least how is he viewed in Japan today? Or is that a simplistic question? Are there many memories of Hirohito?
Oh, it's a great question. It's interesting, Rob, because it's no longer an issue in Japan today, I have to say. But let's go back to when it was an issue, which was in the 90s again, right? This is when this explosion takes place. Showa ended in 1989. It began in 1926. It corresponds to the reign of the man we know as Emperor Hirohito. And the war is right in the middle of his reign. And popular memory of the pre-war part of his reign, pre-war Showa, is very dark. It's the road to war. Post-war Showa is all bright. In fact, they use the word bright, leading to peace and prosperity. And that's the post-war 10 years, post-war 50, et cetera, that I talked about, the names that are given. So the Japanese they've just taken the dark Showa and they've sundered it from the bright Showa, and they're happy to be post-war. Now that emperor, that little man in the suit that you talk about who goes around, he was collecting marine specimens, but it would have been more romantic if he'd collected butterflies.
Thanks for the correction. I want to get my facts straight.
Yeah. So he's walking along, he's in a suit and a hat, and he's very unprepossessing. And he looks very harmless, looking like a nice man. Well, that was the exact same man who was astride a white horse in a military uniform as the commander-in-chief of the Japanese imperial military for that so-called dark part of his reign. It was the occupation, it was the Americans who saved him from being tried at the War Crimes Tribunal, and particularly General MacArthur, and others, I have to say, who thought that keeping the emperor was the best way to reform Japan. And so he's transformed into a democratic emperor. The occupation had a good part in that. And it's hard to imagine the cognitive dissonance, you think, that this man who had been a god until the occupation suggested that he declare himself human on New Year's Day in 1946 was now just a monarch. And by the time you get to the end of his reign, older generations still venerated him. But for younger generations, he was just a monarch, and for that matter, a very boring one, actually. So it's a kind of, I'll say one other thing about it. The issue of war responsibility, which was what's so important. I mean, you said he was a war criminal. We didn't try him because the United States didn't want to. Every other allied power wanted to. Australia, the Britain, they wanted to string him up, and they were not happy with the American decision. The question of his war responsibility is a question for historians, but from memory, what that transformation was, that metamorphosis into the post-war emperor, was to say that he didn't have war responsibility. It was memory would say that. No, he didn't. He's like us, the rest of us. We were, and now I'll give you the other historical narrative that the Japanese have about the war. I mean, the heroic narrative, and that is that the Japanese are a people who were dragooned, caught up in a reckless war by their leaders. And so suddenly Hirohito, the emperor, doesn't have responsibility, and we don't either. So there's a kind of explanation for why I think Japanese publics made that transition, since, well, they were more like him than they were like the 28 war criminals that were tried at the tribunal.
May I redirect us to that very last point you just made, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Here in the West, those trials don't have the same resonance as the Nuremberg trials. You'd be hard-pressed to find a person of goodwill in the United States who thinks there was something wrong with the Nuremberg tribunals. But very often there's been a critique of the Tokyo Tribunal. I think as far back as the 70s, Richard Meniere's book entitled Victor's Justice, which is would be the obvious title for a book of that sort. Is this just water under the bridge for the Japanese today, so long ago, or does it still have resonance? Do people still talk about the Tokyo tribunals?
Well, I think Alex mentioned this too. Both the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals have been discussed a great deal recently, not by popular memory, but in the public domain, because they are now seen as early examples of international law that eventually led to things like the war crimes tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and the establishment of the International Criminal Court in the 1990s. So they've had a kind of resurrection, despite their juridical problems, and they were both victor's justice. I mean, they were both the same in that regard. They both tried a small number of leaders, leaving everybody else, as if you could make a total war with 28 people. But the trial, and let me say something that Gunther said, there were lots of trials in Germany, lots. There weren't lots of trials in Japan. The other war crimes trials that were held out after the Tokyo trial were held by the Allies all over Southeast Asia and East Asia, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Chinese in China. There were lots of war crimes trials for conventional war crimes, not crimes against peace or crimes against humanity. But the Japanese reaction to the war crimes tribunal, first of all, the left criticized the tribunal for obvious reasons. That's Meniere's point too, as victor's justice, but also they joined the Indian judge on the tribunal, Judge Pal. He wrote a dissent because he thought that the tribunal should also have tried Allied war crimes, most importantly, the atomic bombings. So there's been criticism from the left. During the 1990s, during that revisionist seizure that you mentioned, when the Asia War was so important, the nationalist right criticized the war crimes trial for what they called it the Tokyo trial view of history, which put forth masochistic history, that's their term, which focused entirely on what Japan did wrong in the past. So this is a typical right-wing idea that you should not just focus on the negative parts of your past. But in general, the Tokyo trial was not important in 1948 when the judgment came out. There wasn't much of a reaction, and it's certainly not now much of a node in Japanese war memory. It just isn't. They've got that all wrapped up in that maybe in that Pearl Harbor Hiroshima moral equation.
Right.
So it's not a big issue for public memory.
That's interesting to me. This again is what I've learned over the last couple of days is how plastic memory is. It's constantly changing, it seems, based on where we happen to be in the present. You talked about the 1990s as kind of a memory boom, and all of a sudden, Japan, different narratives of the Asia War were coming out that the Japanese were having to respond to. Well, that's 30 years ago. How flammable are the politics of war memory in East Asia today? I use flammable guardedly based on what's happened since February 24th between Russia and Ukraine. But how dangerous are these politics of war memory in East Asia in the present day, Carol?
Well, now that you bring up, now you make me feel better, because I don't think that something like Ukraine is going to happen there, happen in East Asia. But short of that, flammable is a word that I use about memory politics in East Asia. It's an interesting story in some ways, because actually there's been a lot of memory change in Japan. The polls show that most Japanese think that Japanese should pay compensation to the comfort women. They should apologize. They should do all these things. You know, they don't think what the government, at least the government of Prime Minister Abe, thought. So there's been a tremendous change. The acceptance, everybody thinks it's an aggressive war. I mean, the numbers are huge, and younger generations think the same. They've learned that all from the media, which is where you learn all your public memory, as we seen in the conference how important the media are, popular culture, what I call the vernacular terrain.
The first one still?
So Japanese memory has changed.
Just asking to flash the first one. Yeah. Thanks.
But what happened at the same time, I would
think
say,
this was his last question anyway,
is that for reasons of domestic politics, mostly. For example, in China, in the 1990s, after Tiananmen, after the possible democratic subversion, the government intensified, for the second time, I would say, patriotic education for Chinese schools, and they made Japan anti-Japanese. The Japanese atrocities, all of these things in the war, they made them a very important part of the curriculum, which they had not been under Mao. That wasn't Mao's. Mao had this under Mao. The story was that Japan had bad leaders, but the people were not bad. So the 90s, in this kind of national patriotic education in China, created a whole generation of young Chinese who learned basically to hate Japanese, I have to say. I call it hate nationalism. The young Koreans had been, actually, not just the young Koreans, South Korea and Japan had been sort of getting to a kind of rapprochement by the end of the 1990s. They had a summit of the prime minister and the president, and they had a joint World Cup in 2002. And then what happened? I mean, nobody mentioned the comfort women at the 60th anniversary in 2005. Nobody mentioned it. In 2015, that's all the politicians talked about. That's all the Japanese talked about, the Chinese, the South Koreans. And what happened in the meantime was also South Korean domestic politics created, for reasons of domestic politics, the government began to make the comfort women, in whom the South Korean government had very little interest in the 1990s when they first came forward, had made it an issue. So for domestic political reasons, you got a kind of renationalized anti-Japanese narrative, so that Japanese-South Korean relations, which were getting better and better, have taken a nosedive down to the worst relations between those two countries in decades. And so we've been hearing about backlashes and things that have been changed. Well, this was a U-turn almost, and I don't necessarily think that it's going to stay, at least in East Asia. And I can give you reasons for that. But it is something, they have the same kind of toxic politics now, particularly between Japan and South Korea. Of course, South Korea has its colonial period to charge the Japanese with, and the Japanese have not been very good at becoming post-imperial, although I have to say that the British and the French and the Dutch had trouble with that too, and the French have still not got there. So there's a lot going on, and I think that's what I mean about this royal period where things are going on. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to keep going in the same direction, but I do think that there's an East Asian version. Like every time they fight over those islands that Rana Mitter was talking about, where the South Koreans and the Japanese fight about those islands, and the Chinese and the Japanese fight about their islands, they all go back to the history problem. Actually, don't go back to the declaration. I mean, to the the conference declaration that Rana was talking about. They go back to the history problem, and they bring up the comfort women. So that's where we are. Whereas in Eastern Europe, they actually go back to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They go back to the double, triple invasion, depending on the country. They go back to that so-called double, or they go back. They now talk about double genocide. So in some ways, I would say that Eastern Europe, and I'm no expert, but you have really good experts here, like Alex and Omer. That's not happening in East Asia. They're not going back to 45. They're not going back or 37. You're not going back and redoing the whole thing, because they don't have that post-war long period of Soviet domination that drives the national stories of war in Eastern Europe to collapse communism and Nazism. So that's a real difference.
That's fascinating stuff, Carol. I wonder, before we call Jim Grossman, our host for this session, back into play, you've heard, I think, the memory conference from beginning to end. Can you tell us what you've learned, or what your impressions were, some of the things you've heard over the last couple of days?
Well, I couldn't begin to summarize it. It was so rich. I thought every panel was amazing. Absolutely. I learned so much about video games, I have to say.
It's never too late.
It's about time I learned what a first-person shooter is.
There you go.
But it's very important. Rana Mitter said it too. The war video games are huge in China and Japan and Korea. Huge. That's where the young people are learning, and the government actually put some of them out in China. They're not the most popular ones, of course, but so I couldn't summarize it, but I'll tell you things that really struck me. I was struck by how often our speakers said something similar about where they felt we were right now. And the first thing I think was that I felt, again, that they were saying how much the present determines the past, and how much the politics of the changing politics, and that's why we don't know what's going to happen after Ukraine, and the fact that, as Alex says, that the past is weaponized by all these leaders and contested, and that social change also obviously affects public memory, as we saw in the last panel about people who are excluded from the story. But the other present that determines the past, I heard, was everybody's facing or has faced the disappearance of the generation with wartime experience and of their children. And museums have to face how to deal with people who don't know. Young people in East Asia, they may know enough to hate the other country, but they don't know anything about World War II. And we know that 50% of Americans can't name the name of a concentration camp. The Japanese, more than 50% of Japanese in one poll, high school students didn't know that Japan and the United States weren't on the same side. So the present determines the past. We're awash in memory, and we're short on history was one thing I felt. And a second thing I felt from everybody was that we're living in precarious times. The rise of anti-Semitism again, the rise of the right, this backlash we talked about, the fact that any sense of order or stability in our sort of knowledge of the war, or we assumed incorrectly that this was getting settled. And then we have Alex Ritchie quoting that man who knows better, who says, just do not ever imagine that your world cannot collapse. And so, and then I think it was Mark who said, we really can't ask the museum, the World War II Museum, to put post-Cold War in after it finishes the Cold War, because we don't know. That's too much to ask. So the second thing I felt was that the precariousness of living in a time of transition. We're living in a long period of transition that began in 1889 and is not over. And history is happening now, and we can't afford to wait till it's over to try to understand it. We need to pay attention. And that's what leads me, my third point was I felt people saying that we have to figure out what our responsibility is in our times, as historians, as museum directors or curators, as citizens. And, most of us were saying we want history to be more complex and, not so black and white. The memory wants everything black and white, and history is messy and gray. So I hear a challenge, a call to us, all of us in their different registers, by saying we have a job to do now that may be different from what we had imagined in this time of memory sort of washing out history and the past overcoming the present, not to mention the seeming lack of attention to the future, which is, of course, the only thing we can do anything about. We can't do anything about the past. So those are the three things that I found inspiring, just troubling, but also very helpful in terms of trying to do what we do, this history, memory of Second World War, better. So I want to thank everybody.
Wonderful, Carol. Thank you very much. I wonder, is Jim Grossman lurking somewhere in the ether?
I'm still here. I'm still here. And I earlier suggested that Carol should have the last word. And I have to say, I was writing down what it was I would say at the end about 4 minutes ago, right before Carol's last comment. And I was going to quote you, Rob. Earlier you said, we've understated the complexity, which is exactly what Carol just said. And I think that that's our challenge, because if you think about that in relation to Carol's comment also about video games and the issue of how many people, and the institutional plugging here, the American Historical Association has recently done a large study of how the public engages history. And what we know is that the way the public engages history is not from professors. It is to some extent from museums, but that's largely because of their faith in artifacts, but it's also social media. So the challenge is, if we've understated the complexity, and if Carol is right that one of the things we've learned is how to play video games this week, how do we convey complexity? Especially when we go back to something that Alex Ritchie said earlier about nationalistic histories, because when we sacrifice complexity, we end up with nationalistic histories. And what Alex said earlier this morning was, nationalistic histories usually mean saying nasty things about your neighbors. And I think I'm going to leave it at that.
I think that might be a good segue into the Q&A. And Carol said earlier, folks, young people in Asia might know just enough to hate their neighbors. But it's probably necessary to know a little bit more about that, and we've certainly been guilty of that in the United States as well. So, folks, back in headquarters, I think it's my friend and boss Mike Bell. We have some Q&A out there for our guests.
Rob, we do indeed. I just want to thank Jim, Rob, Carol. What a phenomenal, insightful panel. We're going to turn, first the question on the 15 Years' War. Carol, is the term which the Japanese used to describe the World War II experience, the quote 15 Years' War, still in use at all?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because although Japan was in total war against China from July 1937, it had committed its first aggression in North China in the Manchurian incident of 1931. And over those years when the Pacific War narrative, Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, was dominant, the dominant view in Japanese intellectual circles is left. Everybody is left, all right? So the Japanese historians and the Japanese intellectuals coined the term, the 15 Years' War, to make it clear that Japan had been an aggressor against China from 1931, had established a puppet state in Manchuria, and that had been basically at war with China for then. It has never been in general use. It is not in use, for example, even in the newspapers, because the newspapers became enlightened enough to call it the Asia-Pacific War, but they're not going to the 15-year war. So it's a progressive term designed to combat the Pacific War shrinkage of the war from 41 to 45.
No, excellent answer. And then next to a figure that there's certainly different views of him over time. How do the Japanese view General Douglas MacArthur today and his influence on post-war Japan?
Well, I have to tell you that they still love him. Now, most of the young people don't know him, obviously. But MacArthur, he got a pass from the Japanese people. He was very popular then. He wasn't popular with the left, especially after he cracked down on communists and on labor unions and the rest of it. But in terms of popular views, there are these enormous, tens of thousands of letters to General MacArthur, and he still hasn't been obviously the left sees him as an avatar of American anti-communism and all the rest of it, and anti-labor union, etc. But Japanese public to this day does not have a negative view of MacArthur or the occupation, which is part of this post-war story that I'm telling you about. It's part of that. The post-war brought us on the way to peace and prosperity, and that's where we are now, and we like it very much. Thank you.
Well, related to that, maybe is this story even remembered? This next one, how has the memory of the kamikazes been revised or even remembered in post-war Japan?
Oh, the kamikaze never went away. They never went away. Now, this is one example where they didn't have to go away, because they were one of these human stories, and they were told all the time. There's a museum in the south of Japan for the kamikaze pilots. There's lots of popular culture about them. There's all kinds of books about their letters, things like that. The reason they never had to go away is because this is another aspect we haven't talked about. But one way in which Japan, at least, has dealt with their bad war, to use that term, rather than dealing with the Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima story, has been to focus on the home front, on human stories, on the human stories of war, to bring it down to individual levels or group levels or platoon levels, if you like. And the kamikaze, they get a pass because they are young boys, individuals who gave their all and the rest of it. So they've never gone away. And a lot of their appearance in popular culture is not terribly militaristic. I mean, they're in the military museum, the very reactionary military museum in Yasukuni Shrine. But for most people, it's the stories that have kept them alive, and they have been there the whole time, and they're still there in public memory. I mean.
Now, a question related to this bad war era. in your opinion, should Hirohito have been tried as a war criminal?
What can I say? But of course he should have been. I mean, he should have been, because the reasons he wasn't were for instrumental reasons for the post-war occupation, right? If they had decided that he really wasn't guilty, they didn't even get that far. So the reason for not trying, first of all, there were two things. The American pre-surrender planning recommended preserving the emperor, nothing about the war crimes trial, but preserving the emperor for the sake of reforming Japan, because they felt the Japanese people would follow the emperor and that Japan could be made peaceful and democratic under the emperor. That's the first building block. The second building block was MacArthur himself, who pretty much decided single-handedly that they shouldn't try the emperor as a war criminal, partly to fulfill that reform agenda, and partly because I don't know what he thought, but partly because of what he thought. So yes, he should have been tried. He should have at least been investigated. He should have at least been, they investigated a lot of people whom they didn't try, but they never let him get that far.
And this next one then, come back to the previous question. Hold on a second. They just changed it on me. A question on U.S. policy as responsible for Japan's decision to go to war. Was the embargo and the freezing of assets as important as the China War in terms of Japan becoming an aggressor in 1941?
Well, that's the right question, Gary. I think I think the answer is that they were cumulative, and they got worse and worse. In other words, the China War was the real problem, but when America abrogated the trade treaty in 1939, and then it followed in 1940, 1941, and you get oil embargo, you get to all of these things, and it seemed that was the reason for the so-called preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor, because it looked like the Americans were getting fiercer and fiercer. So it was cumulative. It wasn't any one thing tipped them over. And as you know, Admiral, I'm sure you do know that the admiral in charge of the Pearl Harbor did not want to go to war against the United States, but they felt, and particularly the Navy, and Yamamoto was in the Navy, Admiral Yamamoto. So it was cumulative, and I would say that the decision was vexed because the Army and Navy were fussing among themselves about strategy. It was not united. The war cabinet was not united, the war cabinet. But I think the answer is cumulative and no single event.
Nothing like a little inter-service rivalry. So this next one's about film. What impact do you think movies such as The Grave of the Fireflies and Letters from Iwo Jima have on Japan's national memory of World War II?
Oh, thanks, Alex, because now you bring us back to the media and the vernacular terrain and popular culture where I think public memory gets created and maintained and changed. So Grave of the Fireflies, very important. Even more important than Grave of the Fireflies was Barefoot Gen, which is a story of a little boy who survived the bombing of Hiroshima. It was first a comic book, and then it was a play, and then it's been several movies. And everybody in Japan knows Barefoot Gen. Everybody.
Oh, don't have it.
That's not. Letters from Iwo Jima. No, we loved Letters from Iwo Jima. And Japanese went to see it, but it wasn't really important. More important was Barefoot Gen, Grave of the Fireflies, a whole stream of very classic anti-war movies, The Human Condition, really fine films. There are a lot of World War II films in Japan, and some of them are excellent. So I would say that although they liked Corinto, as they call Clint Eastwood, they liked Corinto, that the film didn't have as much, purchase on Japanese as these other stories, most of which were told, as I mentioned, from this kind of humanistic point of view.
No, that's excellent.
Carol, may I ask real quickly, can you tell us again how the Japanese pronounce Clint's name? Can you say
Corinto.
that? What do they call him?
Corinto.
Corinto. Thank you very much.
They like him. That's what they call him.
Excellent. What an exceptional conversation. Thanks to Jim, our chair, to Rob, and to you, Carol, especially, and your ability to answer those rapid fire questions. It's extremely insightful and a fitting capstone, if you will, to this conference. And as we wrap this up, certainly we'll conclude the conference, but not our mission here at the National World War II Museum. Certainly for the folks out there in the audience, you can check our website for content for future events, to include the opening of our Liberation Pavilion, which is wrestling with a number of these aspects that we've touched on in the last few days in these themes. I would like to say thank you to all the folks out there that have hung with us, but also for the incredible questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of those, but the ones that we had time for were certainly insightful and impressive. Thank you to our sponsors again for making this possible. Without them, I don't think we could have pulled this off. And thank you for the tenacity and professionalism of our team. First you saw, Jeremy Collins, our Director of Conferences and Symposia, but also to the team inside that really made this possible. The coordination, the IT, the folks that behind the scenes have really, behind the curtain, if you will, have kind of kept this going. And so, my hat's off to them. This is really an impressive experience, and I'm happy to be part of that. And I certainly learned a great deal in this conference. So I look forward to continuing that mission. With that, to officially close the conference, it's my pleasure to pass this to our President and CEO, Stephen Watson. And with that, Stephen.
Hello again. It's hard to believe that after 3 full days, we've made it to the end of our Memory Wars World War II at 75 and Beyond conference. I want to thank you all for tuning in and for your thoughtful engagement throughout the program. I hope you enjoyed the sessions as much as I did. If you missed anything, I invite you to visit our YouTube page, where we post all of our archive programs, and to share these videos with your family and friends so that they can learn from this weekend's program as well. I also encourage you to stay engaged with all of our exciting upcoming programming, including our 15th International Conference on World War II, which our Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy will present here in New Orleans on November 17th through 19th. This year's program will feature speakers such as Ben McIntyre, Richard Overy, Gerhard Weinberg, Alexander Ritchie, and Don Miller, all presenting on their latest findings and relevant works. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about this and other future programs at wwIIconference.com. Before we close our program, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our Memory War speakers. I believe there were 38 presenters from 7 different time zones, and I know everyone worked hard to rearrange their schedules to continue their participation. I also want to thank the staff who've worked so hard to put this together over the years and then pivoted to make this an all-virtual format and make it successful at that. My thanks to the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, led by Dr. Mike Bell, and Pete Crane, our VP of Education and Access, as well as Jeremy Collins, who served as one of our Master of Ceremonies this weekend. Again, my thanks to Dr. Nick Mueller and his staff, Kaylee Martin and Connie Gentry. Connie especially worked side by side with Nick and the Institute for the last few years to coordinate and communicate with our presenters. Chrissy Gregg and our entire Media and Education Center team, as well as Theo Fogelman and Brett Bonet of our AV department. These teams worked hard, hand in hand, to make this virtual program possible. Those team members in our travel and conference, marketing and communications, and institutional advancement departments, thank you for all of your hard work to arrange this event and promote it far and wide. And finally, our retail team, which ensured that we carried as many of the titles from our speakers as possible. Remember, when you purchase from our web store, you're supporting the museum's educational mission and programs like these. I'd also like to thank Dr. Nick Mueller once more for coming up with the idea and spearheading this important initiative, as well as our conference planning committee members and presidential counselors for putting together another impressive conference lineup. Lastly, again, my thanks to our presenting sponsors, the American Battle and Monuments Commission, and Electronic Arts, Respawn Entertainment, and Oculus by Meta. Without your support, this program simply would not have been possible, and I hope that it has highlighted the great work that both your organizations do. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us today and throughout the weekend. And remember that if you missed any parts of the program or want to share it with others who would be interested, we will be posting the archive on our website in the days to come. I do hope to see many of you in New Orleans soon for any of our upcoming programs or just to visit our museum and see all that it has to offer. Until then, we send you our best regards from the National World War II Museum. Thank you.